This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief over at numberfire.com, and this is episode 148 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the Number Fire Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. Unless you're avoiding social media, which I can't blame you if you are, but you know that the most talked about topic in the NFL this week centered around Le'Veon Bell. The deadline for the Steelers to get a new contract done with Bell flew by, so now he's going to be a free agent next season. He'll play on the tag this year, and then he'll be a free agent in 2019. And I have thoughts about this from both a real and a fantasy perspective. Let's start with the fantasy side of things. I'm not overly concerned about Le'Veon Bell sitting out for parts of the season. He'll lose money if he does that. Now, I get the argument that he won't get injured if he sits. Obviously, if he's on the sideline, he's not going to be playing, so he can't get hurt, and that might help him get a better contract. But given we don't know the type of contract he's going to get in guaranteed money, it would seem odd to walk away from the near $15 million he's going to make this year. And I also think that teams would view the sitting out thing kind of negatively. It's a bad look if earlier in the offseason he says that he's going to play on the franchise tag, which is what Le'Veon Bell said, and then all of a sudden he doesn't. Now, I don't really care if he does that because it's his career. It's not my career. But teams aren't going to like that type of character. So I think we're going to see the same thing that we saw last year. Le'Veon Bell reports to the Steelers at the start of September. He probably starts a little bit slow, and then he's back to Le'Veon Bell form shortly thereafter. So my feelings about Bell really haven't changed. Maybe I'd put Gurley ahead of him in my rankings now only because they were close to begin with, but he's locked in for me as a top 2 guy with Zeke and David Johnson coming in at 3 and 4. But like I said, I also want to talk about this from a real football standpoint as well. Given my feelings towards running back value in football, I can't really blame the Steelers for not giving in and handing Bell a massive contract. Now, I don't know what went down when the two sides were negotiating, but I think it's safe to assume that Bell's side had some sort of number in their head and the Steelers weren't budging. That's why a deal couldn't get done. But what's incredibly important to understand is that this doesn't mean that I'm taking some sort of stance against Le'Veon Bell. This doesn't mean that I think he's stupid for not taking a longer-term deal. And given some of the reports that were out there as to how much guaranteed money he was potentially getting, it made total sense for Bell to not sign a deal with Pittsburgh. You know, it's actually possible to say that the Steelers were smart in not giving Le'Veon Bell what he wanted, all while it being smart for Le'Veon Bell to not sign a deal. It's possible to think that a team is being logical, all while being completely understanding about an NFL player's situation. Too many fans think players aren't human. They treat them as assets above being human. And fantasy football has helped play a role in that. There's no doubt about it. I mean, just think of the phrasing that I use all the time on this podcast and in my writing. I'll say things like, if you're a Julio Jones owner, then you should think about trading him. And really, that's wrong. I wish the fantasy football language was not like this. It's hard for it not to be, but I really wish it wasn't this way because it can have an effect on the way that we view these humans playing football. You know, is $15 million a lot of money? Yes, it's a ton of money. It's money that the vast majority of us will never see in our lifetime. But the vast majority of us will also never work the way a lot of these athletes work. And the vast majority of us will never beat our bodies up the way that these athletes beat theirs up. Some of you listening to this right now may be rolling your eyes. How can I be defending millionaire athletes trying to get more millions out of a contract? Well, how can you not? How can you not understand a player wanting more guaranteed money when his career can end with a blow to his head, where his career can be gone if a defensive player hits him the wrong way? How can you not at least show an ounce of compassion for someone trying to set themselves up after punishing their bodies across the first 30 years of their life? It's possible to understand both sides of the equation here. The Steelers, in my eyes, don't need to overspend for Le'Veon Bell. There's plenty of data that backs up the notion that running backs, and even elite running backs, aren't making a huge impact in today's NFL. But that doesn't mean I believe Le'Veon Bell should take any deal that's handed to him, because he's a human just like I am. And with that off my chest, let's dig into this week's mailbag questions. This first question says, "Hey JJ, I've been thinking a lot about going all in on the Washington tight ends this year. Jordan Reed's injury history has priced him fairly late in drafts, and I can add Vernon Davis at the end of drafts for nothing. Between the consistent usage of tight ends in the Washington system and Alex Smith supporting a top 10 tight end in 7 of 8 seasons, I feel there is a way to lock down a top spot for little draft capital. Jordan Reed is a stud when healthy. Davis put up good numbers while filling in and has played with Smith before. If things go badly, I don't feel like I would have invested much and can move on easily. The negatives seem mostly to be limited upside and using up that extra roster spot. Any thoughts? All the best from Canada, Eric. You nailed this when you talked about the negatives here, Eric, and that's the fact that you're utilizing an extra roster spot by drafting both Vernon Davis and Jordan Reed. I think fantasy managers can often think too cleanly about situations like this in football. It's not that I think the overall analysis is invalid, because it's a pretty smart idea overall. But things don't always happen so perfectly in football. Like if Jordan Reed gets hurt, that injury may not be an injury where he's sidelined. He may play through it. And if he does play through it, then you're weighing starting either Vernon Davis or Jordan Reed in a given week. We've actually seen that in the past. And then all of a sudden, you're not maximizing your roster spot. The tight end position in Washington might score points, but not one single tight end is predictably scoring those points. But then in addition to this, you're ignoring positional value a bit here. We're not talking about a running back or a wide receiver. We're talking about a replaceable position at tight end, one that you can stream. So you're using an extra roster spot on a position that can hypothetically be replaced on the waiver wire. I'm also someone who wants to have as many roster spots as I possibly can available to start the season, because those first few weeks of the season are always super important from a waiver wire standpoint. So here's my overall stance on this. If you have a super deep bench, that's one thing. You can get away with doing something like this a little bit more. But I have a hard time handcuffing a onesie position. But I'm all about Jordan Reed as a later round tight end this year because we know his ceiling is there. If he gets hurt, you can always try to get Vernon Davis on the waiver wire or just start streaming the position. This next question is from @Evan Pasquale. Could Dalvin Cook be this year's Leonard Fournette? Last year we saw a little bit of Cook and he was impressive. Vikings have a solid offense, great defense, best rushing schedule, and no real competition other than Murray. If he looks healthy, he may be my 6th ranked running back. So I asked Evan what he meant by this year's Leonard Fournette, and he said, quote, someone who was drafted in the 2nd round last season and produced top running back numbers. But then he later added that maybe Todd Gurley was the better example. Regardless, I'll just talk about Dalvin Cook because that's what's most important here. I actually think that Cook has a pretty high ceiling. If he's healthy, you're associating him with a team that should have a strong positive game script, and it's one that should score touchdowns. My projections actually like Dalvin Cook a lot. The projections did have Saquon Barkley and Alvin Kamara over him, but I think that Cook is one of those players, along with Leonard Fournette, who has the opportunity this year to jump into that elite fantasy football running back tier. We saw him with 61 of 76 running back carries over Minnesota's first 3 games last year. I mean, Dalvin Cook was pacing towards easily getting over the 300 attempt mark last season. Maybe the Vikings hold him back a little bit this year because of the recovery, but that's elite volume. And to be honest, I think that you could argue that given backfield competition and given potential receiving upside, that Dalvin Cook is the most likely to jump into that top tier than any back currently not in that tier. So as long as reports are positive about his recovery and that he's looking right, Cook to me is in a very strong spot this year. He's a great pick. To me, Dalvin Cook and Leonard Fournette are the main reasons that the back end spot in drafts is still fine from a running back perspective. This next question is from @KuntzCraig. How are you viewing the situation with Aaron Jones? Is he worth drafting at his ADP and holding him for 2 weeks until he returns to a role that has questionable value? The potential is there, but at his current ADP, there's still dependable players available. First off, I think the role has plenty of value. You're associating your running back with arguably the best quarterback in the NFL. The Packers are going to score points, and that's going to create value. I know the last couple of years haven't been great for Packer running backs, but it's a situation that I'm still targeting. I get the questionable piece from a running back by committee standpoint, and I'm sure that's what you meant, but I at least wanted to get that out of the way. Now, I've already talked about how I generally feel about wasting bench space, but I'm far more lenient when we're talking about positions that are in higher in demand, or positions that matter more like running back and wide receiver. We'll see where Aaron Jones' ADP ends up, but to me, Aaron Jones is the best running back on the Green Bay Packers. He was someone that my prospect model liked a whole lot going into his rookie year, and then last season, he had one of the best lower volume seasons that the Number Fire database has ever seen. I think it's valid to be a little bit nervous about Jones coming back and taking a significant role because both Jamal Williams and Ty Montgomery are going to have a chance to shine over the first 2 weeks of the season. But the Packers are also facing the Bears and the Vikings to start the season, so it's not like those backs have the easiest matchups in the world. So Jones is still the player that I'm targeting in that backfield because I think he's the best running back in that backfield. And now there's just a slight discount on him. This next question says, hey JJ, my question is about your prospect model. How does college usage factor into your predictive points model for rookies? Example, Dante Pettis for the 49ers. There's theoretically a lot of targets in a Shanahan offense with what seems a solid quarterback. For him to see opportunity, he would likely be seated behind a 32-year-old Garcon in the slot and Marquise Goodwin as the Z. His size is better suited for the slot at the NFL level, and he played roughly 50% of his snaps in college in the slot. Should I temper his expected totals based on the presumption that he'd be playing slot behind Garcon? Or do I have faith in the offseason and coaching to bring him up to be the X in 3 wide sets? Sorry for the lengthy question, Seth. So there's a couple of things I want to talk about here. First, Pierre Garcon actually doesn't play the slot all that much. Last year, he ran 24% of his routes from the slot. Trent Taylor, on the other hand, ran about 76% of his routes from the slot. So Trent Taylor is actually the slot guy for San Francisco. Will Dante Pettis take his role? I'm not entirely sure. Reports over the offseason said that Pettis was learning all 3 receiver spots, so it's not a lock that he's this surefire slot guy that he was in college. And then the 49ers also drafted Richie James, who profiles as a slot receiver. So I think there's reason to believe the report about Pettis moving everywhere. As for my prospect model, the model itself doesn't actually predict output in terms of fantasy points. It looks at college production and, to your question, usage, and it helps me determine which players are good and which players aren't. And then when they're drafted, I input draft equity to get an overall score of the prospect. And for what it's worth, Dante Pettis was the 8th best wide receiver prospect in this class according to my model. But regarding my projections, those I do on a season-by-season basis. So with Pettis, I'm looking at him the way that I'd look at any other player in the league. And to be honest, right now it's really tough to project a lot of volume for Dante Pettis this season. Hopefully all this helps in understanding things. I've got the prospect model, but all projections are done separately with a completely different and unrelated methodology. This next question is from @EggersK. Why is no one talking about Nick Chubb? Seriously, he may be the most criminally undervalued running back so far. That may not be the case in mid-August, but the chance he surpasses Hyde in touches is greater than his expected point total from a 9th round ADP. I think a huge reason for his ADP is definitely Carlos Hyde, but the sole reason is not Carlos Hyde. Duke Johnson is still in that backfield too. So Hyde is competing for some of that early down work, and we have no idea how much of that pie he's going to get. But then on top of that, Duke Johnson is almost certainly going to take a lot of passing down work. So Chubb's upside, no matter what, because of Duke Johnson, is capped a bit. There's certainly a path to a lot of upside for Nick Chubb this year if things break his way though. But I also think that you can make similar arguments for other folks at his ADP, like Aaron Jones, who I just talked about. Basically what I'm saying is I think Chubb is actually properly priced right now. Maybe he's a little bit undervalued right now, but given the information we have, he doesn't have a super clear path to hit a large fantasy point total this season. This next question is from @JMichaelFFB. Lamar Jackson seems like someone who can make a giant impact in fantasy if he becomes the starter. Any situation where you're streaming quarterbacks and keeping Jackson rostered at the end of your bench? Or does that probability of that happening not match the cost? Yeah, so this one's similar to the Jordan Reed example that we talked through earlier. Quarterback is a replaceable position in fantasy football, and in most fantasy leagues, you can get away without even having a backup quarterback. In fact, in the majority of leagues, you shouldn't have a backup quarterback. So that alone means that I wouldn't be rostering Lamar Jackson. But on top of that, he might not even play this year. And even if he does play, we don't know when that's going to be. That means that you have to hold on to Jackson for a lot of the season, but for a completely unknown return. And we also don't know for sure that Jackson will be a fantasy football stud. I mean, I love Lamar Jackson. I think he's got crazy fantasy football upside, but there's so much in his way right now. He's got to first become the starter. We've got to know when that happens. And on top of that, he's got to be a producer to be relevant in fantasy football. And I'm talking about a top 5 producer because we know that lower end QB1s are replaceable on the waiver wire. If we learn that he's the starter when the preseason hits, then this is a totally different story. But drafting a backup quarterback in a single quarterback league just is never worth it. This last question is from @WhatTheChain. How has fantasy football changed the way you watch football on Sundays? How has fantasy football changed the way you view individual players both on your favorite team and on other teams as well? I'm going to take this question in a slightly different direction and say that fantasy football and doing this for a living has really changed the way that I view fandom. Back in the day, I was an annoying diehard Steeler fan who allowed a Sunday loss to borderline ruin my week. But because I've had to look at the game completely objectively over the last 6 years of being an analyst, and then all the while I was growing as a person and learning new things about myself and the world, I've sort of changed my views on fandom completely. Like, I think fandom is a very good thing. I'm not a believer that all of fandom is bad, but I think there's a very obvious dark side to fandom. When you let something that's completely out of your control take over your feelings and emotions, that's a bad thing. When you take those negative feelings and start to get angry at others and even angry with yourself, that's not a healthy relationship. That's when you know you need to start looking at things differently. So instead, I approached fandom in a way where, sure, I'm disappointed if my team loses. I was born and raised in Pittsburgh, and you're not born and raised in Pittsburgh without loving sports and loving Pittsburgh sports. I love Pittsburgh sports. But if the Penguins or the Steelers lose, yes, I'm going to be disappointed, but I try to think about the fans of the other team who are celebrating over their victory. Maybe that's corny as hell to say, but that's honestly where I'm at right now, and it brings me at least some joy. That, hey, I'm not celebrating this win, but it's important to remember that there's a large group of other people who are celebrating. And that's still pretty cool. Maybe it's not as cool as my team winning, but it's cool nonetheless. So to answer your question more directly, because of fantasy football, I care far less about what my favorite team and players are doing just because they're my favorites, and I'm a much bigger fan of the overall game. And I think that that's honestly a very healthy relationship to have. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks so much for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it on iTunes, Google Play, SoundCloud, TuneIn, and Stitcher. And when you're on iTunes, do me a favor and leave a rating and review. Thanks, everyone. Enjoy your weekend.